Was the entire priesthood system a divine mistake? If Melchizedek's order was superior, why did God establish the Levitical system at all? Could it be that organized religion itself is merely a concession to human weakness, a flawed intermediary, when direct communion with the divine was always the true intention? 1. The biblical enigma, a priest without origin. Melchizedek emerges from the shadows of biblical narrative like a phantom, materializing in Genesis 14 without warning or introduction. Unlike every other significant religious figure in the Hebrew Scriptures, he appears with no genealogy, no birth narrative, and no death account, a startling omission in texts obsessed with lineage and hereditary legitimacy. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, as Hebrews 7 verse 3 later describes him. This absence of origin story isn't merely a textual curiosity. It represents a fundamental challenge to the entire concept of religious authority as it existed in the ancient world. The ancient Near East operated on strict hierarchical principles where religious legitimacy flowed through bloodlines. Egyptian pharaohs claimed divine parentage. Levitical priests in Judaism could only serve by proving their ancestry back to Aaron. Even kings required genealogical validation, hence the extensive lineages recorded for David and later Jesus himself. These genealogies weren't mere record-keeping, they were the very foundation of religious authority. Without the right bloodline, one simply could not approach the divine on behalf of others. Then appears Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High, who shatters this paradigm completely. He blesses Abraham, receives tithes from him, and then vanishes from the narrative, leaving behind questions that would trouble religious authorities for millennia. If Melchizedek could be a legitimate priest without the proper lineage, what did that say about the entire system of hereditary priesthood? If divine authority could exist outside established channels, what became of institutional religious power? This genealogical absence creates what scholars call a theological rupture, a break in the expected pattern that forces readers to reconsider fundamental assumptions. Melchizedek's legitimacy comes not from who his parents were or which tribe he belonged to, but seemingly from direct divine appointment. This concept is revolutionary in a world where access to God was tightly controlled by hereditary gatekeepers. The implications rippled through history. When early Christians sought to explain how Jesus could be a legitimate priest despite not being from the tribe of Levi, they turned to Melchizedek. The author of Hebrews extensively develops this connection, arguing that Jesus belongs to a superior, more ancient priestly order, one that predates and supersedes the Levitical priesthood. This theological move effectively circumvented the entire religious establishment of Second Temple Judaism. This subversive potential hasn't been lost on religious movements throughout history. From the Gnostics of the early Christian era to the mystical traditions of Kabbalah, from Renaissance esoteric societies to modern spiritual movements seeking legitimacy outside established churches, Melchizedek has served as a powerful symbol of alternative religious authority. His mere existence in Scripture provides biblical precedent for challenging religious power structures that claim exclusive access to the divine. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed that certain Jewish sects had elevated Melchizedek to almost messianic status, seeing in him a heavenly figure who would bring judgment and liberation. Manuscript 11Q13, known as the Melchizedek document, portrays him as an eschatological agent of divine justice, suggesting that even before Christianity, alternative Jewish traditions had recognized the radical potential in this mysterious figure. In Rabbinic Judaism, uncomfortable questions about Melchizedek were often sidestepped. Some traditions identified him with Shem, Noah's son, in an attempt to give him a genealogy and thus neutralize the theological problem he presented. Others diminished his importance, troubled by Abraham's payment of tithes to him. These defensive maneuvers only highlight how threatening Melchizedek's example was to established religious authorities. Modern scholarship has suggested various origins for the Melchizedek tradition, connecting him to Canaanite priest-kings, to pre-Israelite Jerusalem cults, or to literary constructs designed to legitimize David's rule over Jerusalem. Yet even these historical critical approaches cannot fully domesticate him. The figure who blesses Abraham remains stubbornly outside the neat categories of religious authority, suggesting that access to the divine might not be as tightly controlled as religious institutions would have us believe. Perhaps most troubling of all for established religion is Melchizedek's dual role as both king and priest, political and religious authority united in one figure. This combination, explicitly forbidden in many religious traditions that separate religious and political power, suggests a holistic approach to authority that transcends the compartmentalization of modern religious institutions. His priesthood is not confined to temples or sanctuaries, but extends into the realm of justice, governance, and everyday life, King of Righteousness and King of Peace, as his name and title are interpreted in Hebrews. In an age where religious institutions increasingly find their authority questioned, Melchizedek's enigmatic presence in Scripture provides a powerful precedent for those seeking direct spiritual experience outside traditional channels. His priesthood suggests that divine connection might not require institutional mediation, a deeply threatening proposition for religious establishments built on the premise that they control access to the sacred. The very brevity of his appearance, just 3 verses in Genesis, has allowed Melchizedek to become a kind of spiritual Rorschach test, onto which various movements have projected their own challenges to religious authority. Yet all these interpretations share a common thread. They recognize in Melchizedek a legitimacy that comes not from human institutions, but from some direct divine source, a priesthood, not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. Hebrews 7 verse 16. As we grapple with questions of religious authority in the modern world, Melchizedek stands as a biblical reminder that the divine may not be as easily contained within institutional boundaries as religious authorities might wish. His enigmatic priesthood continues to haunt the foundations of organized religion, suggesting alternative pathways to the sacred that bypass the gatekeepers and speak directly to the human heart. The author of Hebrews delivers perhaps the most devastating theological critique of institutional religion ever written within Scripture itself. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? Hebrews 7 verse 11. This question isn't merely academic. It strikes at the heart of religious authority by suggesting that the entire elaborate system of temple, sacrifice, and priesthood was fundamentally inadequate from its inception. The implications are staggering. The Levitical priesthood wasn't just being supplemented or reformed, it was being declared inherently deficient. The very religious system established through Moses, with its carefully delineated rituals and hierarchies, its complex purity laws and sacrificial systems, is characterized as a temporary measure, a placeholder until something better could arrive. And that something better is identified with the mysterious order of Melchizedek. What makes this priesthood superior? Several radical features distinguish it from conventional religious authority. First, it precedes the law itself. Melchizedek blessed Abraham centuries before Moses received the commandments at Sinai, suggesting a spiritual authority that exists independent of written revelation or codified religious practice. This challenges the foundational assumption of most religious institutions, that their authority derives from sacred texts or divine commandments. Melchizedek's priesthood suggests a direct spiritual authority that requires no scriptural validation. Second, this priesthood transcends ethnic and cultural boundaries. While the Levitical priesthood was exclusively Jewish, limited to descendants of Aaron within the tribe of Levi, Melchizedek appears as a Canaanite priest-king who nonetheless represents God Most High. This universalist dimension threatens religious exclusivity of all kinds. If God could establish legitimate spiritual authority outside the chosen people, what becomes of claims to exclusive religious truth? The mere existence of Melchizedek in Scripture suggests divine activity beyond the boundaries of any single religious tradition. Third, and perhaps most threatening to institutional religion, Melchizedek's priesthood appears to be direct and unmediated. The elaborate system of intermediaries that characterizes most religious institutions, priests who intercede, rituals that must be performed correctly, sacred spaces that must be properly accessed, all become questionable in light of a priesthood based not on a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. Hebrews 7 verse 16. This priesthood operates not through inherited position or institutional approval, but through direct spiritual power. The superiority of this priesthood is dramatically illustrated when Abraham, the patriarch himself, pays tithes to Melchizedek. As Hebrews argues, this means that even Levi, still in Abraham's loins, generations from being born, symbolically paid tithes to this greater priest. The implication is clear. The entire later priestly system stands in a subordinate position to this more ancient, more mysterious order. The religious hierarchy is turned upside down. Throughout history, religious reformers have seized upon the Melchizedek tradition as biblical justification for challenging entrenched religious power. From medieval mystics who claimed direct divine revelation outside church hierarchy to Protestant reformers who emphasized the priesthood of all believers, Melchizedek has represented the possibility of unmediated access to God. Even the Quaker concept of the inner light, divine guidance available to each person without ecclesiastical mediation, echoes this ancient priesthood that operates outside institutional channels. More radical interpretations have gone further, suggesting that the order of Melchizedek represents a kind of esoteric spiritual lineage preserved through initiatory traditions outside mainstream religion. Gnostic texts elevated Melchizedek to a cosmic figure, a heavenly high priest who preserved true spiritual knowledge, while institutional religion fell into corruption. Medieval alchemical traditions associated him with hidden wisdom transmitted outside church authority. Modern esoteric movements, from Freemasonry to Theosophy, have claimed connection to this mysterious priesthood as a source of spiritual legitimacy independent of conventional religious institutions. Even the traditional identification of Melchizedek as a type, or foreshadowing of Christ, carries revolutionary implications. If Jesus belongs to this order rather than the Levitical priesthood, it suggests that his authority comes not from religious institutions, but from direct divine appointment. Early Christianity's challenge to temple authority was grounded partly in this alternative priesthood that rendered the entire sacrificial system obsolete. One greater than the temple is here, Jesus declared, a statement that makes theological sense only if there exists a legitimate spiritual authority beyond the established religious institution. The superiority of Melchizedek's order raises uncomfortable questions about why God would establish an inferior system at all. The author of Hebrews suggests that the Levitical priesthood was a kind of concession to human limitation, a shadow of the good things to come, rather than the realities themselves. Hebrews 10 verse 1. This opens the disturbing possibility that much of what we consider divinely ordained religion, its hierarchies, rituals, and power structures, might actually represent divine accommodation to human weakness rather than God's ideal. This leads to perhaps the most radical implication of all. If the superior priesthood operates not through heredity, but through the power of an indestructible life, could it be that institutional religion itself is merely a temporary scaffold, destined to be dismantled once humanity is ready for direct divine communion? The very existence of Melchizedek in Scripture hints at a spiritual authority that transcends religious institutions entirely, a priesthood that operates not through buildings or hierarchies or even sacred texts, but through direct spiritual power accessible to all who seek it. If we take the Melchizedek tradition seriously, we must confront a radical possibility. Perhaps organized religion as we know it was never meant to be permanent. Like scaffolding around a building under construction, religious institutions may be temporary structures designed to be removed once they've served their purpose. The order of Melchizedek points toward a spiritual maturity where direct communion with the divine renders religious intermediaries unnecessary and perhaps even counterproductive. This is the theological earthquake that rumbles beneath the brief biblical mentions of Melchizedek. If a legitimate priesthood existed before the law, outside the chosen people, and operated through direct spiritual authority rather than institutional position, then the entire edifice of organized religion stands on questionable ground. Religious institutions typically justify their authority through appeals to tradition, scripture, and divine appointment. Yet here within the scriptures themselves appears a figure whose legitimacy comes from none of these sources. The theological implications cascade through every aspect of religious life. Consider sacred space. The temple in Jerusalem was considered the exclusive dwelling place of God, with access carefully controlled by the priestly class. Yet Melchizedek operated as a priest in Salem, later Jerusalem, centuries before the temple existed. If God could be properly worshipped without a temple, through this mysterious priest-king, what becomes of claims that proper worship requires particular sacred spaces controlled by religious authorities? Consider sacred texts. Melchizedek appears before the Torah was given, before any scripture existed to guide worship. His legitimate priesthood functioned without written revelation or codified religious law. This suggests a spiritual authority that precedes and transcends textual authorization, a troubling implication for religious traditions that base their authority on being the authorized interpreters of sacred texts. Consider religious exclusivity. Melchizedek was neither Jewish nor Christian, yet Scripture affirms his legitimate priesthood of God Most High. This universalist dimension challenges claims that any single religious tradition has exclusive access to divine truth. If God established legitimate spiritual authority outside the chosen people, perhaps divine activity extends beyond the boundaries we draw around our religious traditions. The Melchizedek tradition has proven particularly attractive to those seeking what might be called trans-religious spirituality, approaches to the divine that transcend the boundaries of any single religious system. From Renaissance philosophers who sought the Prisca Theologia, ancient theology, behind all religions, to modern spiritual seekers who identify as spiritual but not religious, Melchizedek represents the possibility of legitimate spiritual authority outside institutional channels. Even more threatening to established religion is the implication that spiritual progress means growing beyond institutional mediation altogether. The New Testament's identification of Jesus with the Melchizedek priesthood suggests that the Incarnation represents God's definitive move to bypass religious gatekeepers and establish direct communion with humanity. The veil of the temple was torn in two at the crucifixion, a powerful symbol of the dismantling of barriers between humanity and God. Some mystical traditions have taken this idea further, suggesting that the ultimate human spiritual destiny is to become priests after the order of Melchizedek, individuals who commune directly with the divine without institutional mediation. This vision of spiritual maturity threatens religious institutions that derive their power and purpose from positioning themselves as necessary intermediaries between humans and God. Religious authorities have typically responded to the Melchizedek challenge in one of two ways. Some have attempted to domesticate him by incorporating him into existing religious frameworks, identifying him with known biblical figures like Shem, or limiting his significance to being merely a type of Christ. Others have simply minimized his importance, treating the Genesis account as an anomaly with little theological significance. Both approaches reveal institutional discomfort with a figure who suggests that the divine-human relationship might not require their mediation. The theological vertigo induced by Melchizedek becomes even more acute when we consider his unified role as both king and priest. Most religious traditions carefully separate spiritual and temporal authority, yet Melchizedek embodies both. This suggests a holistic approach to human existence that transcends the compartmentalization of religious and secular realms that characterizes modern society. In Melchizedek, governance and worship, justice and spirituality, power and service are integrated rather than divided into separate domains with separate authorities. For those invested in religious institutions, these implications can be profoundly threatening. If Melchizedek represents what religion was always meant to become, or perhaps what it was before human structures complicated it, then the elaborate systems of doctrine, hierarchy, and ritual that define organized religion might be not just unnecessary but actually obstacles to authentic spirituality. The superior priesthood suggests that spiritual evolution means growing beyond, not deeper into, religious institutions. Yet this threatening possibility also contains a profound hope. The Melchizedek tradition suggests that authentic connection with the divine doesn't depend on having the right ancestry, belonging to the right religious group, performing the right rituals, or even understanding the right doctrines. It points toward a spiritual reality accessible to all who seek it, a priesthood based not on external qualifications but on the power of an indestructible life. Perhaps this is why Melchizedek continues to fascinate spiritual seekers across religious boundaries. His brief appearance in Scripture opens a door to possibilities that organized religion often closes. He represents a spirituality that precedes and transcends our religious categories, an ancient future where humanity communes directly with the divine without institutional gatekeepers. The final theological implication may be the most radical of all. Perhaps the divine intention was never to establish religion as we know it, but rather to cultivate a humanity capable of direct communion, priests after the order of Melchizedek. If so, then religious institutions are not ends in themselves, but means to an end, scaffolding to be removed once the structure is complete. The mysterious priest-king who blessed Abraham stands as a biblical witness to this possibility, a spirituality beyond religion, a priesthood available to all. No wonder he threatens the foundations of organized religion. Melchizedek reminds us that those foundations were perhaps always meant to be temporary.